Hi, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to take our trusty Ender 3 and we're going to add a BLTouch sensor for auto bed leveling. So in front of me I have all the tools and materials that we'll need, or at least the bare minimum amount that I'm going to use. Of course we have an X-Acto knife, which is always handy. And in this case I'm using a crimper tool. I purchased this for Molex connectors, but I've used it for JST and other types of crimp connections. So this will work very well, I'm sure. If you don't have one of these, you can get away with using needle nose pliers and a little bit of finesse to crimp the connections onto the wires. I've also got wire strippers, which are also wire cutters. It's always handy, but you could get away with using the X-Acto knife if that's all you have. A small Phillips head screwdriver. The screws that come with the BLTouch are Phillips. A small Allen key in order to undo the bolts where our mount is going to connect to, and of course the mount. Now, obviously you want to make sure that you have this printed before you start disassembling the printer or opening the control box and yanking wires out and whatnot. So make sure you have this printed. We'll include a link in the description to the particular mount that we used for this video. We have lengths of wire. So there are 5 leads coming off of the BLTouch. They're only about 15 centimeters long, and we really want those wires to go all the way, in my case I'm going to put them inside this sheath, but all the way in the sheath into the control box. I figured about 3 feet or so would be good. I've got a little bit of extra, but at least 5 of those. And then you have all of the small little bits that come with the BLTouch. You have the screws, which we mentioned, you know, the nuts for them, washers, crimp connections, and little DuPont connectors. Be very careful when you're unpackaging this, because I found some of the DuPont connectors were not in the bag. They're just kind of tucked into the kind of the styrofoam packaging, and I almost threw a few of them away when I threw that out. So make sure that all those are out of there. And optionally, but because I have them, I'm going to use them. I have 2-pin JST connectors, which are going to allow us to kind of have a factory finish on 2 of those wires that are going to go into the Z end stop plug on the board, which happens to use a JST type connection. Sure, you can get away with using a DuPont style connection and just kind of forcing them onto the pins. I'm sure that'll work just fine. Then you're going to need a laptop or some sort of computer in order to flash the firmware. We'll include a link to the firmware flashing video for the Ender 3. Since we've already flashed the bootloader on this, we're free to just flash the firmware without including that extra step. We're going to need to flash the firmware because, one, we have to tell it that we have a BLTouch, and we also have to tell it what type of mount we're using as far as how far that mount moves the BLTouch, you know, in the X and Y direction, as well as a little bit in the Z from the tip of the nozzle. We'll get into the details as to why we have to do that in a few minutes. And last but not least, you're going to need a Raspberry Pi or some other way to print to your printer via USB. You could have a laptop or PC tethered to it. I find that somewhat inconvenient, so having something like a Raspberry Pi, we're going to throw Octopi on it, will allow us to print wirelessly from our laptop. We can just connect to the web page, submit the job, and the printer will start going through the whole routine. You'll probably also want a case for that. Some of the Raspberry Pi kits come with a case, but that's no fun. So instead, we printed our own. It's going to blend in a little bit better in the black finish here. Make sure that you get an appropriate power supply for your Raspberry Pi. This is a Raspberry Pi 0W or W0 with wireless, but they come in the Raspberry Pi 3 larger form factor, and I believe at least the larger ones require a 3 amp power supply. So just make sure you get a good stable power supply for that. The reason we need to print via USB from now on is because the board doesn't have enough memory for Marlin firmware with the BLTouch routine enabled. So as a result, we have to actually disable the code that is for the SD card support. So that's no longer working. This is why we have the Raspberry Pi, and we'll be able to still print. Let's get started. So I printed this mount both in PLA and ABS. This is the ABS one. I found that the PLA version, this little section here that's meant to kind of constrain the wires, keep them nice and neat, was really fragile and snapped off pretty easily. The ABS one is much more durable. The finish on this is not the greatest, but it's dimensionally accurate and it'll suit our needs here just fine. So this bolts on using these 2 bolts here and here on top of the fan shroud, and then we'll bolt it all back up, and then we will attach the BLTouch to it. ensuring that the wire connection for the BLTouch is on the correct side so that those wires can be routed through that little slot, and then we will end up snipping off the ends and having to extend these cables, as I mentioned earlier. The holes for the screws were pretty tight, so I'm just going to pre-thread them kind of with the screws before I try to bolt the whole thing back together. You could also optionally drill them out. Okay, that's good and secure now. And we'll take the BLTouch, and I find it easiest to take the DuPont side of the wiring connectors and feed them up through. The other side is a little bit thicker, and you'll find that, that it sticks in the slot and doesn't slide through as easily. So, upwards. There we go. And then we're going to use the bolts that it came with. I'm going to feed them up from the bottom and then add washers and the nuts to the top. Good. Now in just a minute we're going to get to soldering the wires to extend them. So now I'm going to take my snips. I could use my X-Acto knife if I wanted to. I'm going to remove the zip ties from here. You may not have zip ties. You might have like the factory kind of tape on yours instead. Same thing though. We want to be able to peel back the nylon braided sleeve and run our wire extensions up through there. So now I'm going to make my own kind of color coding scheme because I'm extending, you know, yellow, orange, brown, and I've got colors that are pretty close to matching. I'll just need to make sure that I remember what's what when we get down here. For the most part, we're going to speak in the terms of the stock wire colors, so yellow, orange, brown, black, and white. To extend these, I'm just going to hack the end of these off. So I'll use my snips. Go. And then I'm just going to split them. And then use my strippers to expose a few millimeters, maybe 5–10 millimeters or so of wire. I'll just kind of eyeball it. Just enough that I know I can get a good connection between these and the wires that I'm extending them with, and then solder it all up, and then wrap it in shrink wrap to make sure nothing kind of shorts out in the future. So as I said, I'm going to kind of try to keep the color scheme the same. So the closest thing I have to orange is this red. I'm going to use the red to extend it. Once I've got all of these wires extended, I'm going to run them up through the sleeve into the control box, which is under the bed here. The control box has 2 screws on the front and 1 in the middle at the back that you have to move the bed forward to get to. And I'll take this off now just so I have greater visibility into the nylon sleeve on the inside. I think there's another zip tie on the inside there, kind of pinching that shut. Getting it through this sleeve is going to be probably an exercise in frustration, so I won't bore you with that. We'll come back when that's done. All right, I'm not sure if you can see this, but we're going to be coming inside the nylon sleeve back here. There is another zip tie there, so I'll want to clip that one as well to make sure that they'll pass through just fine. We'll be back when that's done. So we've run the wiring up inside the nylon braided sleeve. We've zip tied everything back together, and the wires are now sticking out of the control box area, as I said they would. We'll tackle the easiest first. In my case, I've used both white and black, which correspond to white and black on the BLTouch. And these are for the ZedMin end stop connection. The white connection will go to the front. So the white cable is going to be the pin closest to the front ribbon cable, and the black will be closest to the rear of the board in the pin labeled ZedMin. You can do one of a few things here. As I mentioned early you could take the DuPont connector, like a 2-pin DuPont connector, crimp those onto the black and white, and just slide that onto the board. But these are actually JST connectors, and you could hack off the end of the JST connector on your ZedMin and reuse the stock one. I'd prefer not to do that. I'd like to go back to stock. So as I said, either the DuPont or we're going to use the JST. They are usually quite difficult to get out, so don't be afraid to put a little bit of pressure on it. So sometimes they even have a little bit of hot glue that's holding the connector into the board so that they don't come loose inadvertently. We'll just tuck that aside. We're not going to use that. And then I'll go through the process of crimping these on. I'm going to use my crimp tool that I described earlier. I'll find one of the slots. It's got 3 different size slots. We're not going to go over in detail how to crimp these on. It's kind of difficult to show on camera, but I will crimp this on, ensuring that the long little legs furthest away from the tip of the connector, there's 2 kind of open little legs. We're going to crimp those onto the sheath of the cable, and that's to kind of stop it from sliding out. And then there's 2 smaller little flaps further towards the end of the cable or the connector, that those 2 will actually pinch onto the wire itself. And that should be pretty secure once we have that done. And then we'll slide these pins inside the plastic kind of sheath and then click that back into the board. We'll be back in a second. So we have the Z end stop now connected, ZedMin with the black and white as I described before, and we're left with 3 colors. Remember, these are slightly different than the BLTouch side. So we have red, which is 5 volt. We have brown, which is our ground. Those 2 are going to go to the ICSP headers. I'll show those in a picture in the corner. And then yellow is our servo signal line, and that's the one that we're connecting to the buzzer. Now the buzzer is the red line in the ribbon cable, so we're going to have to strip the ribbon cable using probably an X-Acto knife, and then splice this directly onto the ribbon cable, the side of the ribbon cable that's obviously coming from the board. So we've downloaded the unified firmware from TH3D. We're going to use this as a starting point, just like we did in our Ender 3 bootloader and Marlin flashing video. This is actually the exact same configuration that I used for that video, so if you haven't watched that, I suggest you tune in there. Under configuration.h are basically all of our options, and they've made it easy where there's a section for each printer. Since we're using an Ender 3, we'll scroll down to there. There we go. So we're going to comment out easy out enable because we're not using that. We are adding in these 4 lines here. I've made some comments to myself aside. So we're using bilinear leveling, so it's like a grid. BLTouch enables the BLTouch functionality in the Marlin firmware. Servo, that's SERVO 0. So servo 0_pin. This is where we're setting what pin number we use to activate the servo, so to extend and retract the probe on the BLTouch. Pin 27 was the red line on the ribbon cable that we cut and spliced into, which used to be the buzzer. So yeah, the beeper on the ribbon cable. So now that beep no longer makes noise, it activates the servo, and Z safe homing, leave that on there. We are going to make sure that custom probe is not commented out. We're using a kind of a custom probe mount or configuration. We're going to specify the X and Y offsets on that, which I had mentioned earlier. So that's all for under the Ender 3 section, I believe. Let me just quickly check my notes here. If we scroll down past all the other printers that they support. So easy ABL points. This defines the grid that we use. So we're doing a 3x3 grid. And scrolling down further, so I have disabled the boot screen completely. This causes it to boot a little quicker. I'm sure it also saves a little bit of memory. I've renamed it to Ender 3, which we did in the previous video. You can call your printer whatever you like. And then down here, so earlier we uncommented the custom probe flag. So because that flag is set, it's going to process this section here. We have commented out EasyABL enable, since we're not using EasyABL, but we are using a custom probe, and we want to set the offsets. So the particular probe mount that we've used, which is linked in the description, requires a 40mm offset to the left on the X, because it's to the left of the hot end, or the nozzle, sorry, and it's -10 because it's 10mm in front of the nozzle. This way, it helps the it helps the hot end know how far in to move to account for the fact that we don't want the nozzle, say, at the corner of the bed when it's probing. We want the probe to be at the corner of the bed. Otherwise, if the nozzle was at, say, the front left corner of the bed, the probe would be off the left-hand side of the bed and would never contact the bed at all, ramming your nozzle into the bed. So that's it for that. Okay, that's it in this file. So then we go to configuration backend, and on here we need to disable the SD card support. So SD support, there it is. Made a note to myself. So comment out this line by putting the 2 slashes in the middle, or in the beginning. This means that we can't use an SD card anymore, but that tells, when we compile it, tells it not to compile all the SD card support code that is in the Marlin firmware, which saves us the required amount of space so that we can enable the BLTouch functionality. Once you've disabled the SD card support by commenting out that line, we should be ready to compile and upload this to the Ender. As I said, I'm already connected to the Ender via USB cable. Let's go and check our tools. Make sure your programmer is AVR-ISP MK2. We're using a Sanguino board, 1284p, 16 megahertz processor, and then choose your COM port. Mine happens to be 4, yours may be different. And then just hit the upload button back here. This will take a few seconds to compile, and then it will upload it to your Ender 3. There we go. So now it's done uploading with no error messages. It will reset your Ender 3, and instead of beeping when your Ender 3 boots, you'll actually hear the BLTouch click a couple times as the probe extends and then retracts, and that is a good sign that everything is working. And next we will configure our Z offset. Before we do the Z offset, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm going to close up the box, and we've got to do something quick on the screen. We're just going to make sure we initialize the EEPROM, which is always a good practice after you flash. So I've turned off the printer, I've unplugged my USB cable so there's no power to the board. I had disconnected the fan that's connected to the cover here. So the fan is going to go back into the fan connector on the board. And then just reassemble the same way we took it apart. 2 screws at the front, 1 in the middle at the back. All right, with that reattached, let's move over to the screen. So on the control panel, press the button in, go to Control, scroll down to Initialize EEPROM, press Enter, or press it down, and you may have noticed that the BLTouch was activated, so we'll do it again for fun. You can hear that clicking noise. That clicking noise used to be the beep sound, but as we mentioned, the beep is now controlling the servo on the BLTouch. So with that done, we can go through the Z offset routine. Okay, so we have the printer on, we have the USB cable connected, and it's been detected in the Arduino IDE. If we bring up the serial monitor, This will actually restart the printer and it will spit out some of its parameters, speed, jerk, acceleration, etc. And the Z offset, which right now is 0 millimeters. So we'd like to check some of the mechanics of the printer, make sure that it's working as expected. You could do some of these on the screen, obviously, like home all axes. So if we do G28, that would home all axes. Make sure that at the bottom, you have both NL and CR selected instead of no line ending, which I think is the default. And this is the baud rate. So G28, if I hit enter, we should see it, hopefully, home the X, the Y, and then it will home the Z, but instead of doing it in this corner, it will center it on the bed and then probe for where it thinks Z equals 0 is. Okay, so now it's home to the Z in the center. And if we tell it to move to where Z equals 0, so this is where it thinks Z homed is, but as you can see, there's a lot of space there. So what we want to do is figure out how far down we need to move that until it's actually dragging on the paper like we would normally level the bed, and that would be our Z offset. So if I'm going to slow it down a little bit. If I move Z to negative 0.3, let's say. Let me take a look at how much space we have there. Yeah, I'll move it down to negative 0.3 and then check and see if there's drag. Nope, no drag yet. So let's move it down to negative 0.4. So these are absolute positions right now. We haven't switched it to relative, so I can't just say go down another 0.1. I have to actually give it the exact coordinates. Now we're moving down to a total of negative 0.4 millimeters. Still no drag. So let's try. Let's copy this. Still no. So the last thing you want to do is choose too high of a value and smash the nozzle into the bed. Wow. We're right about 1 millimeter, maybe 0.9 would be a little bit better. There was quite a bit of drag there. I couldn't even get the paper under actually. Okay. .9 also seems too tight. Okay. I thought I'd already done 0.8. 0.8 looks good there. So that is going to be our Z offset. So we've determined that minus 0.8 is our Z offset. So we would like to set that. We're going to set that with M851. And actually, if you remember earlier, when we got the initial output on the screen, it told us M851 is 0. So now we're setting that value. M851, we're going to set Z, sorry, 0. So we're telling it the offset is minus 0.8. Okay, and then we want to save that. So we can do M500. That will save it to the EEPROM. And that way, if we reboot, turn off the printer or whatever, it will load that value the next time. And if you were looking here again, you would actually see that value. So I've closed the serial monitor. If I reopen the serial monitor, it will reset the printer. We'll hear the BLTouch activate, and then we'll get the output I described, and there is our offset. So minus 0.8. So now, if I go through the auto leveling routine, G28, it's home all axes, G29, we should be good to go. So you can include G28 and G29 at the beginning of your G code, your start G code, and that way it will do that routine before every print. It'll be inserted into the top of the G code file. So you don't have to remember to manually do that. Let's go to the printer screen now. If doing it through the serial monitor is a little daunting and you'd rather not issue the G code that way, you can do all of these Z offset functions on your screen. So go to Prepare, go to Move Axis, Move Z, then you can choose 0.1 millimeter increments, and this way you can move it up or down in 0.1 millimeter increments until you're at a Z offset where the drag on the paper is adequate. And then you would want to take whatever your value is there. So if we go back to the main screen, it'll tell you what your Z is at. So right now my Z is at 4.68. Obviously, I'm not dragging on paper, but in our test, that would have been at minus 0.8. So once we're at a point where it's dragging on the paper, go to Control, go to Motion, and then you can set your Z offset. You can see that that's already been set because that's what we did through the G code. So you would go in there and set it to minus 0.8, or as close as you can get. And then go out one menu and make sure you store the settings. This is what we did with M500. The BLTouch will click, confirming that the setting has been stored. So we have the BLTouch working and auto leveling. The last thing to do is add some smarts. I've put the Raspberry Pi in here. I've loaded Octopi, which is a distribution that you can flash to the SD card. Configured that to connect to my Wi-Fi. I'm going to need power for this, so you'll have a separate power cord. And I might just connect this with two-way tape or Velcro, or I may actually design a different mount to snap into the extrusion here. So I'll have that connected there. And then you'll just need USB into the front to send the G code over USB for you. You'll submit your jobs to the web interface for the Raspberry Pi, which will vary depending on the IP address scheme in your house or the DHCP address your home router has provided to the Octopi. We'll provide a lot more details on how to set up the Octopi, how to flash it and configure it, and get you up and running in another video, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully you found this helpful. Remember to like and subscribe and ring the bell to get notified when we upload more content. And leave a question down below or a comment and let us know what other types of videos you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching.